And now on Poltax TV, it's time for a special investigative reportski from our Scottish correspondent Grouchy McGrumpy, as he investigates the woman king of Jockland, Nicola Sturzinski.
Independence is not a miracle economic cure.
I am Scottish. I can complain about things. I can really complain about things. Now, give me your coat.
We want this and that. We demand a share in that and most of that, some of this and fucking all of that.
I am cold.
I'm cold.
There's no point in us both being cold. Give me your coat. Give me your coat.
And another thing, we want it now. I want it yesterday. I want fucking more tomorrow.
I can see right now why the jocks want out. Right, I can see why the Scots want to leave and go form the People's Republic of Jockistan or whatever they want to do. I get it.
Jockistan is a one-party state, and it's not one country. Never has been. It's always been divided between the Scots in the south and the Celts and Picts in the north. Lowlanders and Highlanders. Never trust a Highlander, especially if they come from Fife. Treacherous bastards, the lot of them. In terms of ancestry, the Lowland Scots are essentially Ulster Irish, which accounts for all that Rangers and Celtic bollocks, whereas the Highland sheepshaggers think they are the true Scots, and never mind the Vikings. Nicola McStalin, from Irvine in Ayrshire, has been First Minister of Jockistan since 2014, and her bigoted SNP racists have been in power since 2007. That's 15 years if you can't count, which, if you've recently been through what passes for the Scottish education system, you probably can't. In 2014, McStalin and her former mentor, Alexei Salmonilovich, finally got to hold the independence referendum that forms the basis of their bigoted National Socialism. And they lost, by a margin of 10%. But when you're a progressive politician like McStalin, making progress towards totalitarianism, losing doesn't make you a loser. It simply means the McSheep got it wrong. So all you do is bide your time and try again. And again. And again. The UK Supreme Court recently ruled that the McStalinist government in Edinburgh cannot hold a second independence referendum without the UK London government's consent, which came as no surprise whatsoever to anyone who had actually read the 1998 Scotland Act and understood what it said, rather than saying it said what they wanted it to say.
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
We must and we will find another democratic, lawful and constitutional means by which the Scottish people can express their will.
McStalin conveniently ignores the fact that the Scottish people have already expressed their will. The people have already had a say. They said no.
The very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried.
Despite the whining of Lard Arse McSporran at Westminster, Jockland is not being held captive against its will. A clear majority of Jockland voluntarily chose to remain in the UK in 2014. Whether there was a Tory government or not was irrelevant.
In my view, that can only be an election. It's better than just deciding Scottish democracy isn't worth anything and that people don't have a say.
McStalin says the Scottish people must be allowed to have their say. Again. Trouble is, they've already had their say once, and that's plenty. When she talks about democracy being denied, McStalin is being typically duplicitous. Jockland exercised democracy in 2014, and democracy told the McStalinists to bugger off and think again. But that won't stop McStalin and her adoring acolytes from throwing their toys out the nationalist pram. Nicola McStalin, clan chief of the sociopath Cybernats, recently revealed her Marxist mentality to the biased Broadcasting Corporation's Laura Spoonsberg.
I detest the Tories and everything they stand for.
23% of the population voted Conservative in the last Jockland Parliament election in 2021. If you were one of them, Nicola McStalin detests you. To her, you're the equivalent of Hillary Clinton's deplorables.
I detest the Tories and everything they stand for.
Almost a quarter of Jockland are detestable, according to McStalin. So much for inclusivity. and her Hitler-esque othering of those who disagree with her shows her for who she really is.
I detest the Tories and everything they stand for.
For what it's worth, there are many Scots who detest the SNP and all it stands for, which is bigotry and racism. And yet, for all her thinly veiled anti-English rhetoric, McStalin is quite happy to go on a taxpayer-funded jolly to that London, to hobnob with the Tory toffs and the English aristos for Liz True's farewell gig and Charlie Three's debut turn. Hypocrite, much? More people live in that London than in the whole of Jockland, which means McStalin is about as important as a local mayor, on a par with Sadiq Khan, otherwise known as Sadiq Can't Get a Grip on Knife Crime. The McStalinists held their annual Hate Fest, or party conference, in Aberdeengrad earlier this year, with the SNP brown shirts all creaming their knickers at the chance to hear from the dear leader. Not so much Big Brother as Big Sister. I am surprised they didn't start with a 2-minute hate and picture of Liz Truss, the pub quiz questioned Prime Minister at the time. McStalin talks about democracy, but she only likes democracy when it gives her the result she wants, which is probably why she's so keen on rejoining the EU, as that's their standard tactic too. When the people give you the wrong answer, make them vote again until they get it right. Scotland voted to stay in the UK, and then the UK voted to leave the EU. So what if the McBrown shirts wanted to stay? Tough shit. Get over it. Listen to this political genius.
It's our right to decide. It's our right to decide. It's our right to decide.
What this drone lacks the intelligence to understand is that the Scots have already made their choice. They chose to stay British and Scottish. But the McStalinists are pathologically obsessed with being Scottish and European, rather than just Scottish. If the Brown Shirt Brigade really wanted to be independent, they would leave the UK and stay out of the EU. But they don't really want to be independent. They just want to be independent of the bastard English. The SNP refuse to admit they are losers, and so they do what they always do. They change the terms of the debate. Instead of it being about independence, it's now about democracy, which is exactly the sort of political sleight of hand that McStalin is famous for. McStalin wants to misdirect voters and politicians alike into sleepwalking into her carefully prepared trap of treating an election like a referendum. A majority vote for the SNP is not a vote for independence. Conflating the two is a cynical attempt at confusing the issue. The Jocks have already had an independence vote, and McStalin lost. Democracy my arse. The only people denying democracy are the SNP. They've been in charge for 15 years and still expect us to believe that everything that's wrong with Jockland is someone else's fault, not theirs. There's a good Scots word for people like McStalin: sleekit. Cunning, underhand, crafty, and above all, deceitful. This isn't about Scottish democracy being undermined and denied. This is about democracy being perverted to justify another go at getting the result the McStalinists wanted the first time round, when they lost. The McStalinists are bigoted control freaks who stand for totalitarianism. McStalin's Digital Scotland initiative proposes a World Economic Forum-inspired digital ID, so the government can keep track of your spending on online activity and, in time, like communist China, impose a social credit score system so the government can control your access to both the internet and your bank account. McStalin is the dear leader who, if you remember, needlessly locked down Jockland for its own good during the pandemic, and like all politicians with an agenda, she didn't let a beneficial crisis go to waste.
It serves us well as individuals to be independent of the state. There's clearly nothing that a controlling authoritarian government fears more than an educated, healthy, strong population of self-sufficient, independent individuals who can take responsibility for themselves.
The fear-filled McSheep submitted themselves to face mask foolishness and vaccination blackmail, and passed the compliance test the globalist wolves set for them. And for all her anti-English bigotry, McStalin was quite happy for Jockland to be part of the UK vaccination programme. The SNP are losers, and Nicola McStalin is a political psychopath. She calls herself a real feminist, implying there are fake feminists, but at the same time throws real women under the Jock bus by supporting fake trans women. And where was the support of this real feminist for Joanna Cherry when she got turfed out of the Westminster branch of the Deep Fried Mars Bar party after getting rape threats? But then, Cherry's a transphobe who thinks only women born with vaginas are women, so when it comes to feminism she doesn't count. So much for the sisterhood. And why are all these lady Jock politicians munters and rug munchers? You don't see any Rhiannon Sugdens in the SNP, do you? But then it's no wonder McStalin supports trans women, because she looks like a bloke in a dress. More Eddie McIzzard than wee Jimmy Cranky. The McStalinists' gender recognition bill is little more than legalised child abuse. They want to allow 16-year-olds to legally self-identify and change their gender after 3 months, without a gender recognition certificate following a doctor's diagnosis of them having the condition of gender dysphoria. Jockland even has its own version of the infamous Tavistock Clinic in England. The Sandyford Clinic in Glasgow, like the Tavistock, operates an affirmative approach to handing out puberty blockers to children, undermining both parents and teachers. But nobody on either side of the border wants to talk about detransitioners, those who later regret having an irreversible sex change. Detransitioners exist, but they don't fit the sponsored by Stonewall narrative of the McStalinist government, and so their voices go unheard, and their lived experience, which the left are usually so keen on promoting, gets ignored. When it comes to abortion, McStalin is quite happy to not only allow the murder of unborn Scots babies, having none of her own, but also to deny the right of opponents of the murder of the unborn the opportunity to protest. So much for free speech. There have been 10 million abortions in the UK since the Abortion Act of 1967. 10 million. To put that in context, a certain Austrian house painter murdered 6 million. A certain Russian henchman of Lenin murdered at least 9 million, and a certain Chinese communist is estimated to have murdered roughly 5 times that many, thanks to famine and the Cultural Revolution. Jockland's Cultural Revolution is to ensure the McSheeple are fed a diet of racist resentment and contrived injustice to keep them subservient, so mud up to the eyeballs, and enslaved to the state.
You need slaves to be a tyrant. It's a hell of a lot easier to hoover up all the power.
As for free speech in Jockland, the only free speech the McStalinists want to allow is pro-SNP free speech. McStalin has backed proposals to set up censorship zones, exclusion zones around abortion clinics to silence those detestable Scots who hold pro-life views. A move designed to prevent them from possibly changing a woman's mind about murdering her unborn child. We can't have that now, can we? No. Much better to murder an unwanted baby than to have it and then put it up for adoption. If you're a childless couple in Nicola McStalin's Jockistan, you can go fuck yourself. And it was McStalin's mob that was behind the named persons scheme. Remember that one? Where the Jock government wanted to appoint someone to tell you how to raise your kids. Very libertarian. As well as being incapable of understanding written law, the McStalinists are also unable to appreciate legal tradition. The McStalinists are proposing to remove the right to trial by jury for those accused of a hideous crime of rape. Why? Because, according to Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain, conviction rates are too low, which rather assumes that those accused are guilty before they've been convicted. And as we all know, no man has ever been falsely accused of rape. If you have been, then if the McStalinists have their way, your fate won't be decided by 12 of your peers. Only one person has to be convinced of your guilt based on evidence. Now, where else in the world have we seen trial by judge rather than trial by jury? Oh yes, Communist China and Nazi Germany. So what do Nicola McStalin and the post-feminism Stalinist Nazi Party stand for? Well, how about bigotry and racism, killing unborn babies, climate change eco-wank, child abuse, free drugs for junkies, intolerance and wokery? Nicola McStalin is the woman king of Jockland, ready to sell the Scots back into slavery to the EU. For one thing, it won't be as easy to rejoin as she makes it out to be, and for another, she's talking shite when it comes to the post-independence currency. There won't be a Scots pound. McStalin knows full well that if it does manage to rejoin the EU, Jockistan will have no choice but to use the euro, which means Scottish banks won't have their hands on the levers of power over either monetary or fiscal policy in Scotland's independent of the English economy. The European Central Bank will be in charge, not the banks of Scotland. But then, independence for the McStalinists only means being independent of the bastard English, and dependent on the European Union. They don't want dosh from Westminster, but they are quite happy with money from Brussels. The English taxpayer spends more money per head on the jocks than they spend on themselves, but don't go looking for gratitude in Edinburgh grad, or an appreciation for the benefits of that extra spending. If the SNP really believed in independence, like they say they do, their aim would be to leave the UK and stay out of the EU. To give the hackett old witch her due, it's a measure of how skilled a political manipulator she is, but McStalin continues to get away with advocating rank hypocrisy as party policy. Nicola McStalin says she's a Democrat, but really, she's a Marxist. Nicola McStalin says she's a nationalist, but really, she's a National Socialist. Nicola McStalin says she's a feminist, but really, she's just a cunt.
We love you, jocks, so fuck off, will you?